Welcome to the Synthesis of Yoga, the book that changed my life. We are diving deep into Sri Aurobindo's The Synthesis of Yoga, and we have reached the 8th chapter of part 1. And this chapter is called The Supreme Will. You can find the link in the description below. Kindly follow the text, because very act of reading Sri Aurobindo and his vision, imbibing his vision and his consciousness through the very act of reading, that's the sadhana here. And that's my personal experience of transformation just by the very act of reading Sri Aurobindo, because we connect to a light and force that is very, very cosmic, because he has established himself in a level of consciousness. From there is a vision and a transmission that takes place, and that is what is encapsulated into these books. And so while we read, we are getting reformatted in that light and force. So welcome to this adventure of sadhana of the synthesis of yoga. Today we are getting into episode 107, and this will be the last episode of this chapter. In our previous episode 106, we have explored the idea of liberty, the absolute freedom that comes through the karma yoga. How does karma yoga lead us towards identification, oneness with the supreme will? The core theme of this chapter, the supreme will, and how do we recognize the supreme will. So I highly recommend those who want to really dive deeper into the how to recognize and how does this movement takes place towards identification with the supreme will. I recommend listen to the previous episode where we saw detaching from the identification with the life and its drama, the movie of life, the witness standing back, and the turning inward to open to the will of the Shakti, and the Shakti lifting you to identification with the supreme will. And that will is a vision and a will at once, the supreme will, which is also a vision, that's a creative power that molds and that pours into the instrument like the sun and its radiance of light, Satchidananda, radiant out of delight of the being, pours in, and that acts through the instrument where there is no desire, no reaction, and no responsibility, with the profound calm, peace, wideness, and power that acts through. And there is nothing for the instrument to do other than being this vast, free, open, receptive condition for a greater will to act in its cosmic work, whatever it intends to do in the world. So now we are moving on to episode 107. We are starting with paragraph 15. But even before that highest approach to identity is achieved, that is what we covered previous episode, identification with the Supreme, the Lord, Ishvara and Shakti. Something of the supreme will can manifest in us as an imperative impulsion. So what we discussed in the previous episode was a complete identification. But that's a long journey of sadhana. Before we arrive at that stage, there are many stages and ways the supreme will begins to act through us. And the very first one is imperative impulsion. A greater force intervenes and propels us. It is imperative. You cannot deny, you can refuse. That's one way the divine will enters. It is not the mechanical action of the Prakriti, habitual action of the Prakriti, but an immense conscious will. You feel something has intervened into your life. Something you might have been caught up in some difficult situations, crying out for help. Suddenly a great impulsion enters, propels, doors open, difficulties are removed. Act of grace, I say great impulsion, and it moves you into action. It's not just a perception, it's an impulsion. It propels you to act and takes you out of the limbo where you are stuck. So that's one of the ways the divine will, supreme will will act through you when you open to the Shakti and her action. An imperative impulsion, a God-driven action. So that's how it is unfolding, a God-driven. It's not your drive, it is God-driven action. We then act by a spontaneous self-determining force. A spontaneous self-determining force. But a fuller knowledge of meaning and aim arises only afterwards. It is the power that acts. You still don't know where it is leading you. The knowledge is still not there. The meaning is not there. But there is a force that you cannot resist. You must act. Action first. The force is moving you. You don't know the direction. You don't know the meaning. You surrender to it. You trust. You know that force by its quality. It is not increasing restlessness and fear and anxiety in you. Instead, it is growing in peace, calmness, wideness, joy. But you don't know. In your mind, meaning and knowledge is veiled. But there is an imperative impulsion to act. It's a God-driven action. Where it is taking, you don't know. But you're happy to go with that inspired, that imperative action. But even before that highest approach to identity is achieved, something of the supreme will can manifest in us as an imperative impulsion, a God-driven action. We then act by a spontaneous self-determining force. There's a force which is spontaneous and it determines what it will do, where it will go. But a fuller knowledge of meaning and aim arises only afterwards. Having crossed certain distance in that action, the process, you will discover, oh, this is where it was leading me. Knowledge is revealed down the line, not in the very beginning. In the beginning, what you're getting is an imperative impulsion. That's one of the ways the supreme will acts, and you can recognize its nature. The next one is, or the impulse to action may come as an inspiration or intuition. That's the next way, another way the supreme will can enter. The impulse to action may come as an inspiration or intuition, but rather in the heart and body than the mind. So intuition acting in the heart and body. See here, he is giving indication of intuition can act in the mind, intuition can act in the heart, intuition can act in the body. Here, the impulse to action may come as an inspiration or intuition, but rather in the heart and body than in the mind. So intuition and inspiration coming to the heart and body so that there is a movement towards action. Here, an effective sight enters. Sight. Remember, in the previous episode, the supreme will has its vision as the will. A ray of that supreme will enters and it reveals in you and in your heart a vision. Rather, here an effective sight enters, but the complete and exact knowledge is still deferred and comes, if at all, later. So there is a vision that is given, but the complete knowledge and exact knowledge, a complete understanding and exact knowledge, you do not have yet. If at all it is coming, but it is held back. So there is a impulsion to act, And there is an inspiration, and there is an intuition, and a ray of light is entering in you as a vision, but you don't know exactly where it will lead you. In the previous one, it was just action, the imperative impulsion propelling you to do something, but you have no idea where it is taking. In this second mode, there is a sensing, a seeing, a sight may enter, a little glimpse that you see, but it is acting through your heart's intuition, and body is propelled to act, and exact knowledge is not given. So the impulse to action may come as an inspiration or intuition, but rather in the heart and body than in the mind. Here, an effective sight enters, but the complete exact knowledge is still deferred and comes, if at all, later. So it may come later, it may not come at all. There is no guarantee that knowledge, exact knowledge will be given. But there is an entry of a sight, which is effective sight. It is not ineffective sight, it is an effective sight because it's a force in action. Otherwise, we have visions, sights, but no action because there is no force behind it. Supreme Will has that nature. It not only is sight, but it's an effective sight that propels things and moves things. Effective sight enters in, but the complete and exact knowledge is still deferred and comes, if at all, later. You may get clarity, you may not get clarity. But when that lucky vision enters, there is an impulsion to act. But the divine will may descend too as a luminous single command. That's the third way it enters. A luminous single command. We can recall from Sri Aurobindo's life when he got the inner command. He was running Karma Yogin periodical and firing up the nation, and he got this command, Adesha, stop this work and go to Chandurnagar. And he drops everything, he leaves for Chandurnagar. That is a luminous single command of the divine will. The Supreme Will enters and gives that command. The divine will may descend too. Descend, it is something that comes from above. It enters and gives a luminous single command. Or a total perception, or a continuous current of perception. That's other ways it enters. Perception, a total perception. You see this entire situation in its totality in a single gaze, a single vision, or a continuous current of perceptions. Vision after vision, revealing layers after layers into depth and widths and heights of the complex situation. You see and see and see cascades of floodings of vision. So a continuous current of perception of what is to be done. You know exactly what is to be done. Unlike the first two, the very first one, all that you know is what is to be done. You have no clue why it is to be done, but there is an imperative will that is acting and moving you. In second one, there is an inspiration or an intuition, an effective sight that enters, but knowledge is still held back. Third one, there is a command, do this, and you just do it. And now here is the fourth one, a total perception or a continuous current of perception of what is to be done into the will or into the thought or as a direction from above, spontaneously fulfilled by the lower members. So there is the will that acts. Into that will there is a perception that is pouring in. a total perception or a current of perception that enters the will or into the thought, or as a direction from above, spontaneously fulfilled by the lower members. Lower members, the vital and physical, spontaneously obeys. Reception happens in the mind, into the thought, or into the will, and the body, everything else follows. But the divine will may descend too as a luminous single command, or a total perception, or a continuous current of perception of what is to be done into the will or into the thought, or as a direction from above, spontaneously fulfilled by the lower members. There is no questions, there is no doubt, and it is spontaneous obedience to the greater supreme will that is taken up the instrumentation, and you're just receiving. So these are 4 different ways the supreme will enters before the complete identification with the supreme will is arrived at. So first is imperative impulsion to act without knowledge. Second is inspiration and intuition with the effective sight, but knowledge is still held back. Third is the command, a luminous command that propels you into action. Do this, that comes from above. The fourth is a total perception or a currents of perception entering into will or thought, a direction from above, and the lower members spontaneously obeying and executing. The nature follows that will. When the yoga is imperfect, only some actions can be done in this way. Obviously, there is a long journey to make. When the yoga is imperfect, only some actions can be done in this way, or else a general action may so proceed, but only during periods of exaltation and illumination. So there are periods where we feel exalted and illumined by the greater influx of the divine light and force. In that exalted moments, we feel that we are carried and moved by that. When yoga is imperfect, only some actions can be done in this way, or else a general action may so proceed, but only during the periods of exaltation and illumination. So we do have this occasional inspired action, illumined action, and then we fall back to the old routines of imperfections, sluggish, muddling our way through life. When the yoga is perfect, all action becomes of this character. That is where we are heading in this yoga. That spontaneous action of the divine will, acting through calm, wideness, peace, clarity, joy, and the power that nothing can stop. Nature obeys spontaneously. We may indeed distinguish 3 stages of growing progress, by which first the personal will is occasionally or frequently enlightened or moved by a supreme will or conscious force beyond it, then constantly replaced, and last identified and merged in that divine power action. So that's how the 3 stages begins. First, the personal will is occasionally or frequently. We have our personal individual will. This will get enlightened or moved by a supreme will or conscious force beyond it. We recognize that something else is acting, something beyond us is acting. Then continuously replaced and last identified and merged in that divine power action. So there is a frequent enlightened movement, then begin to get continuously replaced. Instead of a frequent illumination, it becomes continuous, constant, and then there is a complete merging and identification with that power action of the supreme will. That's the first stage. It is the will is taken up and illumines. It enters frequently, then increasing of that frequency, it becomes continuous, and there is a complete merging and identification of the will. That's the very first stage in karma yoga. We may indeed distinguish 3 stages of a growing progress, by which first, the personal will is occasionally or frequently enlightened or moved by a supreme will or conscious force beyond it, then constantly replaced and last identified and merged in that divine power action. Divine power action. The first is the stage when we are still governed by the intellect, heart, and senses. That's where we are starting. Our intellect, heart, and senses, these are our governing agencies. The first is the stage when we are still governed by the intellect, heart, and senses. These have to seek or wait for the divine inspiration and guidance and do not always find or receive it. This is our first training, waiting for the divine inspiration and revelation to come. It may not come. So the first is the stage when we are still governed by the intellect, heart, and senses. These have to seek or wait. Seeking, waiting, seeking. There is an active seeking. Waiting, you are quietly waiting for the divine inspiration and guidance and do not always find or receive it. So even if we are seeking, it's not necessary that we find it or receive it. It is a possibility. We wait receptively, calmly, patiently. That is one of our early stages. First stage. The second is the stage when human intelligence is more and more replaced by a high illumined or intuitive spiritualized mind. An external human heart by inner psychic heart. The senses by a purified and selfless vital force. So these 3 things. In the first stage, senses, heart, and intellect in its normal operations. In the second stage, the intellect is replaced by an illumined or intuitive spiritualized mind. Illumined or intuitive spiritualized mind. The higher ranges of the mind begins to be operationalized, and they will replace our normal laborious intellectual processing. It is replaced with this illumination, intuition entering into mind. Similarly, heart will be replaced by inner psychic heart. We normally live in our outer emotional human heart. Deep within there is a psychic heart. So there is a shift towards the psychic heart. Mind is shifted towards the higher spiritual illumined intuitive part. Heart shifted towards the psychic, and the senses. The senses by a purified and selfless vital force. Purified and selfless. Our normal vital movements are highly egocentric, self-centric. Once that is erased, the vital force becomes selfless and purified. So the senses are no more craving for its pleasant sensations. It is free. And there is a samarasa, enjoyment of all sensations. And there is the flow of that purified senses. And the vital force flows through it. So that is the condition required for the second stage to come in. In the first stage, normal operations of the intellect, heart, and the senses. In the second stage, all 3 instruments are getting replaced with the higher, illumined, spiritualized, intuitivized intellect, psychicized heart, and a purified and selfless vital. The third is the stage when we rise even above spiritualized mind to the supramental levels. That is the third stage, where the mind, spiritual ranges of the mind will be left behind to the supramental level. And Sri Aurobindo has mapped the ranges above our normal intellect, the higher mind, illumined mind, intuition, overmind, all that are to be transcended to enter the supermind. And that is the third stage where a perfect dynamic identification is achieved. And integral yoga insists that that is where we need to reach the summit in the journey, establish in that, and that has to radiate downward into lower instrument, into mind, vital, physical, and transform them. So these are the three stages. The first is the stage when we are still governed by the intellect, heart, and senses. These have to seek or wait for divine inspiration and guidance and do not always find or receive it. The second is the stage when human intelligence is more and more replaced by a high, illumined, or intuitive spiritualized mind. The external human heart by the inner psychic heart. The senses by a purified and selfless vital force. The third is the stage when we rise even above spiritualized mind to supramental levels. That's the journey we make in this yoga of divine works through the successive three stages. In all three stages, the fundamental character of the liberated action is the same. Fundamental character of the liberated action. There is a bound action, there is a liberated action. We are going through the part of the yoga of divine works. So there is a liberated action in this context, and we are opening to the supreme will, and this chapter is giving us insights into that. In this liberated action, there is all three stages, character is the same. What is that character? A spontaneous working of Prakriti. This is the chief indicator. A spontaneous working, a profound harmonious obedience of the Prakriti. No longer through or for the ego. Ego is not the door through which it enters. No longer through or for the ego, but at the will and for the enjoyment of the Supreme Purusha. The enjoyment and the will of the Supreme Purusha, the Supreme Will and Supreme Being who is acting, and Prakriti is delightfully open to the influx of that light and delight through her limbs that are spread across the planet, across the cosmos. There is a flow of that Ananda gushing through, starting with the individual mold, and through that it is flowing into the larger nature, spontaneously obeying the supreme will of the Purusha. At a higher level, this becomes the truth of the absolute and universal supreme, expressed through the individual soul and worked out consciously through the nature, no longer through a half perception and a diminished or distorted effectuation by the stumbling, ignorant, and all deforming energy of lower nature in us, but by the all-wise, transcendent, and universal Mother. So as we ascend to the higher and higher levels, at a higher level, this becomes the truth, capital T, of the absolute and universal supreme. The truth of the universal supreme will find its expression, expressed through the individual soul. Individual soul is the recipient mold through which the truth of the absolute and universal supreme is flowing through, and worked out consciously through the nature. Worked out consciously through the nature. no longer through a half perception and a diminished or distorted effectuation. So our normal condition is a half perception, limited perception. None of that. No longer through a half perception and a diminished or distorted effectuation. Perception and effectuation in action. All things are cleaned up. So there is a extreme effectivity. By this a diminished or distorted effectuation by the stumbling, ignorant and all deforming energy of lower nature. Our lower nature has its distorted effectuation, half perception and stumbling ways. It is ignorant. That lower nature and its operations are replaced by the all-wise transcendent universal mother. The higher nature, the universal mother, would enter and replace the lower nature and her limited ways of functioning. What are these? Half perceptions, distorted effectuations, stumbling and ignorance and all deforming energy. All that are replaced by the all-wise, transcendent and universal mother. That makes everything spontaneous, effective. The Lord has veiled himself in his absolute wisdom and eternal consciousness in ignorant nature force. So the Lord has veiled himself and his absolute wisdom and eternal consciousness. Absolute wisdom and eternal consciousness is the very nature of the Lord. But who veiled himself in ignorant nature force, Prakriti Shakti, ignorant nature force, and suffers her to drive the individual being with its complicity as the ego. The individual being is shaped through the formation of the ego. That is, ego is the first formation that enables the individual to be carved out of the mass consciousness. So the Lord has veiled himself in his absolute wisdom and eternal consciousness in ignorant nature force and suffers her to drive. Why he suffers? To drive the individual being with his complicity as the ego. This lower action of nature continues to prevail, often even in spite of man's half-lit, imperfect efforts at a nobler motive and purer self-knowledge. So even when man acquires this nobler motive and a pure self-knowledge, effort is still half-lit, imperfect. So this lower action of nature continues to prevail, often in spite of man's half-lit, imperfect efforts at a nobler motive and a purer self-knowledge. So in spite of having our self-knowledge and nobler motive, efforts remain imperfect, half-lit. And that continues in nature. This lower action of nature bound by the ego, and that suffering still continues. The lower nature is still a limitation, a space of bondage. And the divine has entered into it and is through these veils is also suffering. Our human effort at perfection fails or progress very incompletely owing to the force of nature's past actions in us. Her past formations, her long-rooted associations. So nature's established habits of the past are there, and that is the bondage in which things are locked up. So our human effort is at perfection fails or progress very incompletely. Why? Owing to the force of nature's past actions in us, her past formations, her long-rooted associations. It turns towards a true and high-climbing success only when a greater knowledge and power than our own breaks through the lid of our ignorance and guides or takes up our personal will. So unless that greater knowledge and will and knowledge and power enters and replaces our human individual will, this stumbling will continue. So that replacement of the individual will with the divine will and power is absolutely necessary if the lower nature is to be transformed. Otherwise, it is impossible to transform it. For our human will is a misled and wandering ray that has parted from the supreme puissance. That's the supreme power. The sun of the supreme power, radiant. Out of that, one ray has wandered off. That little ray is our individual will. For our human will is a misled and wandering ray that has parted from the supreme puissance. The period of slow emergence out of this lower working into a higher light and pure force is the valley of the shadow of death for the striver after perfection. So we are immersed in the lower nature and her workings, stumbling our way through. At the period of slow emergence out of this lower workings into a higher light and pure force is the valley of the shadow of death. It is not death, it is the shadow of death. Death has cast its shadow in the lower nature and her workings. And it is there the struggle is, the grip of the shadow of death for the striver after perfection. It is a dreadful passage full of trials, suffering, sorrows, obscurations, stumblings, errors, pitfalls. So there is a journey to be made. And we have to walk through this valley of the shadow of death. It's a dreadful passage full of trials, suffering, sorrows, obscurations, stumblings, errors, pitfalls. It is inevitable. If we want to transform the lower nature, if we do not want to transform the lower nature, if we are to only exit into the higher consciousness, this is not applicable. If we are to transform this lower nature, then we have to face this valley of the shadow of death. It is a dreadful passage full of trials, suffering, sorrows, obscurations, stumblings, errors, and pitfalls. To abridge and alleviate this ordeal or to penetrate it with the divine delight, faith is necessary. Because our narrow human mind and its limited knowledge is utterly incapable of guiding and leading us through this valley of the shadow of death where we go through the trials. We need faith, absolute faith in the supreme will, its protection. To abridge and alleviate this ordeal or to penetrate with the divine delight, faith is necessary. An increasing surrender of the mind, surrender, faith, surrender. Second is the surrender, an increasing surrender of the mind to the knowledge that imposes itself from within and above all, a true aspiration and a right and unfaltering, sincere practice. Unfaltering, sincere practice. So here we have the core keywords of integral yoga. Faith. You need an unshakable faith, and you need to surrender, an increasing surrender of the mind to surrendering to what? To the knowledge that imposes itself from within. So mind has to surrender, faith, surrender. Above all, a true aspiration. You need that fire that is burning, yearning for this liberation, this transformation, this union with the Supreme. That is absolutely needed. If that is not burning in you, the progress will be sluggish. So that's a third, aspiration. And a right and unfaltering and sincere practice. A practice that is sincere. Once you are drawn to this, once you have the call for this adventure, then sincerity. Sincerity here is a complete adherence to the divine guidance and light and its guidance. So, living only for that, obeying only that, nothing else. Practice has to be absolutely sincere. So the faith, surrender, aspiration, sincerity, these come in as core qualities, inner qualities necessary. Faith is not a technique. Surrender is not a technique. Aspiration is not a technique. Sincerity is not a technique. These are inner capacities, qualities to be cultivated little by little, systematically. To abridge and alleviate this ordeal, or to penetrate it with the divine delight, faith is necessary. An increasing surrender of the mind to the knowledge that imposes itself from within, and above all, a true aspiration and a right and unfaltering sincere practice. Abhyasa, continuity of practice, a sincere practice. Here the practice is inner practice. Practice unfalteringly, says the Gita, with a heart free from despondency. So the heart should not be bound by anxiety, despondency, depression, sadness, anger, fear, nothing. A glad, peaceful heart. Practice unfalteringly, says the Gita, with a heart free from despondency. The yoga. For even though in the early stage of the path we drink deep of the bitter poison of internal discord and suffering. So in the very early stages of yoga, this is part of the journey. We drink deep of the bitter poison of the internal discord and suffering. That reminds me of the manthan, the image of the churning of the ocean, in which all the toxins and the poisons comes out. The transformation requires that churning. In that churning, all that needs to be transformed comes out, and toxins comes out, the poisons comes out, and that is to be drank. Bitter, we drink deep of the bitter poison of internal discord and suffering. Our internal discord and suffering. There is an internal conflict, various parts pulling in different directions. All that are to be faced, and there is a discord and suffering. It comes with it. That bitter poison has to be drank. And we have in the mythology Shiva drinking that poison, and Parvati holding the neck, and then this Adam's apple forming. That is a mythological story. The speech becoming pure. We have to purify. In spite of drinking all the poison, our speech has to be pure. We drink deep the bitter poison of the internal discord and suffering. The last taste of this cup is the sweetness of the nectar of immortality and the honey wine of the eternal Ananda. So before getting the nectar of immortality, honey wine of the eternal Ananda, there is the bitter poison to be handled. Of that discord and the churning that takes place within the individual, within the collective life, has to be met, has to be addressed. But practice diligently, unfalteringly, says the Gita, with a heart free from despondency. No matter how challenging the situation, no despondency. We need calm heart, absolute unshakable faith, sincerity, aspiration, and a deep surrender to the divine light and guidance from within. That alone takes us across this valley of the shadow of death and this bitter poison of internal discord and suffering, and take us towards the last taste of this cup is the sweetness of the nectar of immortality and the honey wine of eternal Ananda. That's our journey, beautifully captured. So the divine will, the supreme will that we have explored in this chapter, and identification with this Supreme Will, various stages of identification. And we saw that this the supreme impulsion to act, or an inspiration with an effective insight, or a command, a single command, or a total perception entering into thought and will and mobilizing. So all these are ways we enter and progressively identify. And in that journey, initially we start with the mind, heart, and senses in a normal condition. Then they get replaced with higher illumination, psychic influence, in psychicization of the heart, and purification of the senses. Then we enter into a complete union. And in that journey is all this valley of death and the bitter poison, and eventually the honey wine of the nectar of eternal Ananda. So with that, we come to the end of this chapter. Thank you for being with me in this journey, in this sadhana. Let's enjoy this journey. All the bitter poisons of life, all that is bringing in the discords and the challenges and the difficulties, all these are part of the adventure. And practice diligently, unfalteringly, and with a heart free from despondency. Thank you. Please do share your inspirations, insights, suggestions for improvement. See you next week. Thank you.